I'd say to young Rob, physiotherapy was a great choice of profession because, it's a good profession. It's doing something good. It's making the world better. One scary thing about AI, I think, is they don't know what is true. I spent quite a lot of time in Brazil and had a wonderful time there.
Neste episódio do Physio Frontiers, mergulhamos na trajetória inspiradora do professor Rob Heber, um dos nomes mais influentes da fisioterapia baseada em evidências. Descubra como ele começou sua carreira, o que o levou à pesquisa e à criação do Pedro Database, e suas reflexões sobre o futuro da profissão com o avanço da IA.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Physio Frontiers podcast, our podcast in partnership with the Physiotherapy Evidence Database Brazil. Today we are very happy to have Professor Rob Heber with us. So many of you may know him from the book Practical Evidence-Based Physiotherapy. I would say this is the most influential book in evidence-based practice for physiotherapists. Rob is a physiotherapist and emeritus professor fellow at Neuroscience Research Australia in Sydney. He has a long-standing interest in evidence-based practice, having introduced the teaching of evidence-based practice into the undergraduate physiotherapy curriculum in the early 90s. In 1998, he and colleagues developed the Pedro database, and he recently qualified as an accredited biostatistician and now runs a statistics consultancy. So thank you, Rob, so much for being here today.
Thanks, Chia.
To start us off, I would like to go back to the beginning, and I would love to hear from you. Why did you decide to become a physiotherapist, and also how did you end up going into research?
When I finished school, I had no idea what physiotherapy was, except that I saw physiotherapists run onto the field in the football games. I was a football player. I love football. And I thought, that looks pretty cool. I'll go and do that. And we had a couple of women live down the street from me, and it turned out they were lecturers at the university. It wasn't a university, it was a college back then. They taught physiotherapy. So one of them took me off to a rehab place, and I watched her do proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, PNF. Do you know about PNF?
Yeah.
Sort of an ancient part of physiotherapy. I watched her do.
Was a thing back there.
Yeah, I watched her do PNF on someone that had a stroke. I thought that was amazing. So, I signed up to be a physiotherapist. And of course, I realised that fairly quickly that it wasn't all sports physiotherapy and it wasn't all PNF. But that's how I got into it.
Oh, that's amazing. Quite similar to us, actually. I think Bruno and I, we also choose physiotherapy because of sports, and that's amazing. And how did you end up going into research?
Well, that really was unplanned. I never really considered teaching, and when I started teaching, I didn't even think of research as a possibility. I got into teaching because I used to go to continuing education courses quite a lot. Back then, my interest was primarily in neurological physiotherapy, and I went to quite a few courses run by Roberta Shepherd, who you might know of Shepherd and Carr and Motor Relearning Program. Roberta Shepherd was a very dynamic and interesting speaker and full of ideas. So I used to go to her courses, and eventually she sort of recognised my face and she asked me if I'd like to come and teach. And I thought, I'll give that a go. So I went along to the university, and so back then it was a college, not a university, and started teaching and enjoyed the teaching a lot. But back then, and so we're talking in the mid-80s, there was almost no physiotherapy research. In fact, I can kind of remember the first pretenses of physiotherapy research in the middle 80s, and it was, a case series here and, an observational study there. But people were trying, and they were trying to make things happen. And but I had a lecturer, Ron Balnave, a neurophysiologist, who got me interested in muscle things, and he talked me into doing a master's. I didn't know what a master's was. I didn't really know about PhDs. I didn't have any family that had anything to do with universities. But I loved doing research. I had a great time doing it. Met some great people. Had some great discussions. And so I started off in basic science. I was doing originally investigating adaptations of muscles properties in rabbits. And then I did a PhD in human neurophysiology. with a fantastic mentor, Simon Gandevia, who I still work with now.
That's amazing.
So I started off and of course back then, because there was no physiotherapy research, there was no research base. You couldn't go and do a PhD with a physiotherapist as a supervisor, and you couldn't actually study physiotherapy as part of your PhD. You know, everyone who had PhDs back then, and there weren't very many of them, they went and did biomechanics or neurophysiology or, social sciences, but nobody actually studied physiotherapy as part of their PhD.
Wow. Oh, that's super interesting.
And still about back in the days, we interview Annie Mosley in the first episode of this podcast, and she told us all about the beginning of Pedro, and she did mention that pretty much started because you had a pile of randomized control trials in your desk. According to her, it was more than 1 meter high. So do you realize that this pile of papers would become Pedro right now, and how do you see, like, looking back to what happened, like, did you ever imagine that it would be as big as it is right now?
Okay, so and just so the record's kind of precise, what Anne said is not wrong, but just to get it exactly right. So we were given the option of teaching an optional subject for fourth year students, and I decided I'd got interested in randomized controlled trial design, and there's kind of a history behind that. But I thought, all right, I'll run an optional subject for fourth year students on using randomized controlled trials to examine the effectiveness of physiotherapy intervention. And I did that for probably 3 years or 4 years. It ended up running for, I think it's still running now in a different form. But as part of it, I got students to ask a clinical question and go and find 3 randomized controlled trials and critically appraise them and decide what that meant for their clinical decision making. And after 3 or 4 years, I had this pile of trials. I think I had 300 or something like that. And, there weren't that many randomized trials in physiotherapy back in the early 90s. So it was kind of a bit of a treasure trove. And I was working with Kathy Sherrington at the time, and we were saying, well, this is a really valuable research resource. How are we going to make it useful for everybody? And it was around about the time that this thing called the internet came along. Back in those days, this is all back in those days stuff. This is old timers stuff. But back in those days, people were just starting to get a computer on their desk and starting to use email and starting to access the internet. I think Netscape came out somewhere around there. So we put it on the web as Pedro, and that was the start. I kind of knew it was a useful thing. I expected that physiotherapy would get interested in randomized controlled trials because we've been talking the talk. In Australia, I think actually, Brazil, it was kind of a similar sort of time for the leading universities in Brazil. But in Australia, it was at the start of the transition from a sort of a craft profession to an academic profession. We went from having diplomas to bachelor's degrees. We started having people with PhDs. We talked about the science of physiotherapy. So there was a lot of talk, but not much substance behind it. There was just, a few hundred randomized controlled trials, but it was obvious that was where the profession was going to go.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Fantastic. And maybe now thinking on the future, how do you see Pedro evolving in the future? Do you think there is potential for Pedro, for example, to grow using new technologies, AI tools? What's your opinion on that?
I suppose I will largely leave it to the next generation who are smarter and better with AI than me. But I'll just reflect on a few days ago. I had a look for the first time at an AI-based interface for doing instant systematic reviews. What was it called? Ellipse? Something like that. And it was pretty cool. I mean, it wasn't perfect. It's still a fair way to go with that technology.
Like, would you believe in an AI-generated systematic review for a clinical question?
Not now, no. But it was, with this particular system, which is free. You can ask a clinical question using, English language. You don't have to type a search query in. And it goes and finds relevant systematic reviews and randomized trials, and it extracts the data from them and gives you a quantified answer about an estimate of the size of treatment effects. It was quite good. I probably would be a bit critical about, I just ran it on a topic which I knew. I was a bit critical about which sources of evidence it chose. I thought it did a really good job of extracting evidence and coming up with a summary. So I think it's getting there. And you look at, ChatGPT is the most unbelievable, amazing, revolutionary bit of technology. It kind of makes everything else look, it makes mobile phones and smartphones look kind of ordinary. It's just such an amazing technology that it's where we have to go, and whether it can be incorporated into the workflow with Pedro, or whether it's going to supersede Pedro. Maybe these AI are going to, they're going to scour Pedro and use Pedro. I don't know how it's going to work, and it's up to smart, young people like you to work that out, I think.
Yeah. That's very nice to hear, Rob, and very positive, actually. And maybe focusing a little bit more about on EBP, and also considering the rise of AI, like large language models and machine learning. How do you see this changing, specifically on EBP in the future? Do you think it's going to be like a improvement? Like, what looks like for you?
I suppose what always happens when you get these innovations, you could think in some ways of clinical trials as being an innovation. It's a much simpler innovation than a large language model. But they bring with them tremendous promise, and they inevitably get abused and exploited, and you just hope that the promise outweighs the exploitation. With large language models, with AI in general, I suppose a worry is that the computer geeks who are doing amazing, unbelievable things but don't know anything about clinical practice, and who don't have a responsibility to individual patients, they're the ones who are generating this technology. And certainly I've seen it happen in other areas. I work a lot with biomedical engineers, many of whom are brilliant and really incredibly capable people. But technology without an interface with patients, without an understanding of patients' problems, without an understanding of how people's problems get solved in the real world is maybe a bit of a dangerous thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, those AIs, they're pretty impressive, but maybe deep down they still lack some, human nuances, which is expected, but it's already pretty amazing. Yeah.
One scary thing about AI, I think, is, I just read a book by Stephen Wolfram about how large language models work. And this is the guy who wrote Mathematica, who is a kind of a genius. He was staggered by what these large language models do. But he makes one obvious point, and that is they don't know what is true. They just go and take another word. I think technically they take another token, and they just stick it on the end of everything that they've done up to now, and they just keep adding words, but they know nothing about the truth. In fact, they don't even understand physics or causation, or they don't understand how the world is structured. So it's kind of amazing that they do as well as they do. It's staggering. It's absolutely staggering that they do as well as they do.
Yeah.
But it's still not quite right.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah. So Rob, moving to the human side now, about teaching evidence-based practice, something that I've been doing since 2019 at more formally at the university. So I've done trainings for both university students, clinicians. And I think one thing that I often notice is how difficult it is for them to navigate uncertainty in practice. Kind of rely on the best available evidence. It's not the same thing as having the evidence I wish I had. And also from our side as researchers, university lecturers, we don't usually face that clinical uncertainty kind of in front of the patient at real time. And I think that's where maybe we lose some clinicians. They may feel evidence-based practice doesn't quite speak to them or to their reality. Yeah. So how do you think we could better support clinicians to make evidence-based decisions when the evidence isn't just clear or isn't complete? How to embrace this uncertainty to better train clinicians?
It's a fantastic question, Bruno, and it shows you've been there and you've kind of tackled, it's a big issue. It's the core in some ways. And I know as a writer and a teacher, it's easy to pretend that the process is simple. And in some ways, that's part of what teaching is. It's providing a simple structure and a scaffold that, in some ways avoids real complexity. But it's absolutely true that most clinical decision, despite 50,000 randomized controlled trials, most clinical decision-making will still be made in the presence of a moderate or high degree of uncertainty. That's the way the world is. I suppose that's why we value clinicians who are wise and good at making decisions, and why ChatGPT won't be treating back pain for a while yet, because clinical decision making in the presence of uncertainty involves talking to people and understanding them. It's a social interaction, and those things are critical. And clinicians should feel good about the fact that they're making decisions in the presence of uncertainty, because machines can't, academics can't.
I always feel that embracing this uncertainty should be part of being a good evidence-based practitioner or clinician. But it is very complex, and we are often confronted with questions from students and clinicians with that, okay, what do I do now? I don't have this evidence. I don't have I feel that this intervention may work. But it's very.
Of course, that's what we do it every day in life. When we're buying a refrigerator, it's not like there's a randomized trial that says, buy a Kelvinator fridge. There's uncertainty. There's lots of information, some of which is good and some of which is bad. And there's a cost that comes to it, and there's a potential benefit. And we weigh those things up, and we do that every day it doesn't make us that anxious. I mean, maybe we get a little bit anxious over a fridge, but not that much. We make decisions that are trade-offs in the presence of uncertainty all the time. And some people are better at doing it than others.
And Rob, how do you think is the best way to make evidence-based practice meaningful and engaging for students today? Things have changed over the time, but do you have any key suggestions on how to make this meaningful for students nowadays?
That's probably the question I'm least capable of answering, because it's been a little while since I've been teaching, and I see things are changing so quickly in the way in which people use information. Just the idea of a textbook. I was talking to my wife. She's written a book as well. She's an academic physiotherapist, and we were saying, books. I mean, I'm not sure that anyone would even really read, not a paper book anyhow. Maybe an online book, but maybe not. The way in which people access information is so different now. I don't have a good handle on that. So possibly I'm not a good person to have an opinion on that.
And since you mentioned book, I think your book, your collaborators, I think the latest edition is more recent, the third edition. And I'm curious about what chapter did you see most change over time? Did you have to update many things in some particular chapter? Or I think mine is probably the second edition, maybe. I have the first edition, the second one. But I think you have the third.
Oh, good on you, Bruno. It was largely incremental, and part of the increment was our understanding. We wrote the first book, the first edition, I think it was back in about 2005, something like that. At that time, I'd been doing randomized trials for maybe 10 years. I'd been teaching evidence-based practice for a little bit longer, but definitely my understanding grew. I found little things that I'd written in 2015. I found things that I'd written in 2005 that I didn't like very much. So it was a bit incremental. I think the structure I was still pretty happy with. I kind of like the structure, and of course we borrowed the structure. It was David Sackett who was the originator of the whole approach to critical appraisal that has become kind of the paradigmatic sort of feature of modern evidence-based practice.
Wow. And a few more things about Tia was reading your introduction, and then I think the last sentence was that you're now a biostatistician. So I'm just curious, like, how do you feel becoming like you became a student again, you trained again as a biostatistician after such a long academic career, actually being on the other side? What was it like going back to study, being a student, being assessed after all those years?
It was great. I had some fantastic teachers. The particular course I did was run by a consortium of Australian universities. So each course or each part of the course was run by a different university that had particular expertise in the area. So there were some great teachers, not all of them. So some of them were not that great, but it was fun. I learned an enormous amount. I've been doing statistics since the 80s, and I'd become moderately proficient. I was a bit worried when I started the course that I wasn't going to learn anything, but I learned something every day.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and I really am grateful that I learned a lot from it.
That's amazing.
That's very, very inspirational as well. All right, so maybe just to wrap up for today, Rob, if you could go back in time, and that's it, considering physiotherapy or research or whatever you prefer, and give some advice to your young Rob, what would you say?
I'd say to young Rob, physiotherapy was a great choice of profession because, it's a good profession. It's doing something good. It's making the world better. It's kind of nice to get to an end of a career and feel like probably it was a net force for good. And maybe in some professions you can't do that. So I'm grateful I went into physiotherapy. Good work, young Rob. You did. That was a good call. I think it was good to have got into research. There's probably strategic things I would have done better. I would like to have more seriously learned about methodology early on in my career, but I have very few regrets, so maybe I wouldn't have changed very much. I'm grateful for the fact that my career took me to lots of places in the world. I got to see physiotherapists all over the world. I spent quite a lot of time in Brazil and had a wonderful time there. And, I'm just very happy with how it all worked out.
Right.
Young Rob was not smart.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Rob, for your time and for this amazing interview, and very inspirational. And congratulations to such an amazing career. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gia. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you, Rob. It was great. Thank you.